You are watching a Preserve Minneapolis video presentation, celebrating the city's historic, architectural, and cultural resources through advocacy, education, and public engagement.
Good evening. I'm going to sit down simply because I'm now at the age where if I stand for an hour, I start to feel it. But what we're going to do, I'm going to give you the history of the streetcar system here, and then the last part of the program, since this is Preserve Minneapolis, is we're going to see pieces of the streetcar system that are still there with before and after pictures so you can see what it was. Anyway, this is kind of how many of you remember the 620 Club? Okay, Moby Dick's? Okay, well, Moby Dick's is what replaced the 620 Club with all the bikers out front and all that. I think we're on top of the Great Northern Market here from this angle. And if you look, you'll notice, by the way, I think part of the point of this shot was to show the safety zone in the street. See all those people waiting to board the streetcar standing out in the street? And there's a little sign, let's see, where is it? Yeah, just ahead of the back door of the streetcar. There's a little sign standing in the street that says safety zone, and that was the city's rather naive attempt to keep the people waiting to get on from being run over by a streetcar. So anyway, I got a couple kind of introductory shots here. This is Lake in Bloomington. You're looking west on Lake Street. You'll notice that the drugstore, painted white, is now in multiple colors because this is a Hispanic neighborhood now. And let's see. Fossberg Opticians at the Streetcar Museum, we just got a little item in. It's a little watch fob with a tin button on it and a Twin City Line streetcar logo on it, and that's because Fossberg Opticians was apparently selected by the streetcar company to go and check the watches of the motormen and conductors for accuracy and to be a watch dealer for them. I was real surprised. I hadn't known about that. Surprised when that came in, but this is a real typical look. The streetcar tracks were in the center two lanes of the street. You walked out in the middle of the street to get on. It was illegal to pass a streetcar with your automobile because you might pick off a pedestrian, although as you can see in that downtown shot, there was sort of an exception to it. Okay, let's see what we got here next. This is Washington Avenue in front of Kaufman Union. You see the footbridge up there. Once again, just a couple of scenes to set it. This is the east end of the bridge. This is 26th and Nicollet, looking south. Cheapo Records is across the street to the right, and I think that's Black Sheep Pizza where it says Butler Drug, if I'm correct. And this is in the north side. This is the corner of Broadway and Emerson, and it was a big transfer point. You're looking east on Broadway. There was a Broadway crosstown. Emerson was the Chicago and Fremont line, and look at all that wire up in the air. That's where the power came from. A lot of people didn't think it was very aesthetic to look at, but you could sure tell where the streetcars ran. And this is over at the corner of Central Avenue Northeast and 4th Street Southeast. That's, I think, is that a Veda now, or the old? Yeah, the old S&L department store. If you look way out in the distance there, you can see one of the big natural gas containers. There were a couple, three of those around town that were gas holders. Here's the bottleneck. And you're up on top of the Plaza Hotel looking south. You can see the big church there. The North American, well, at the extreme right, the old Walker Arts Center, and the North American Life Insurance building with the buffalo out front. They moved it. The buffalo's out in St. Louis, out in Golden Valley now. Yeah, any of you remember driving through the bottleneck when it was this way before? A couple of them. I remember riding with my folks, and it was anarchy. you have Lyndale and Hennepin crossing at a very shallow angle, and so cars would sort of enter one side and work their way through without any particular lanes or anything and hope you came out the other side. And in the middle of it were streetcars.
It worked though.
Right. So anyway, let's get into the history. This was taken in the 1920s, and this is the transaction that went on thousands and thousands of times a day. At their peak, which is about this time, over 200 million people a year rode the streetcar system. And I'll put that in perspective for you. The metro area was about 600 and some thousand back then, 238 million people. Now the metro area is 3.5 million, and it's about 90 million people, just to give you kind of a comparison. And that's because everybody rode the streetcars. This is how you got around, and it's actually what formed the city. And so this is Central Avenue looking northeast. There's that same gas holder there in the distance. And this is 7th Street, which turns into Monroe, taking off to the left, Electric Machinery Company on the right. But consider the fact that this is a railroad running down the middle of the street, which would seem to be a very bad idea. And so you have to go back to the early 19th century to figure out why there's a railroad running down the middle of the street. If you've been to any of the colonial era original cities in North America, if you've been to like the old part of Boston or the oldest part of Philadelphia or Minneapolis, those places weren't very big. They were about a mile square, say before the turn of the 19th century. And if you wanted to go somewhere, you'd walked. Unless you were pretty wealthy, you probably didn't have a carriage or a horse in town. Well, along comes the Industrial Revolution. People start pouring in from the countryside. It doesn't take too long before the cities get so large that you can't just walk everywhere conveniently. So they needed some kind of form of transportation, public transportation, and they came up with large carriages that ran on established routes, and you put in your coin, and they were called omnibuses, which is where we get the word bus from. And not particularly nice to ride. The streets were either cobblestones, so they had a very rough ride, or they were dirt and they turned to mud, which made it even hard for a horse to pull them through. But starting in the 1830s, along comes the new technology of the railroad. And it didn't take too long for people to figure out that if you had an iron wheel running on an iron rail, you had a whole lot less rolling resistance, and a horse could pull a whole lot more, and you had a reasonably smooth ride, and you didn't get stuck in the mud. And so starting in the 1850s, really in New York is where it started, and then it spread throughout the country, were horse-drawn streetcars on tracks in the street. And that's where it started. And so they looked like this. They started in the Twin Cities. Well, there was something called the Minneapolis Horse Railroad in 1869, and it only lasted a couple years, and it didn't work out. And it ran from the Milwaukee Road Depot, if you know where that is, up 2nd Street to the St. Paul and Pacific Depot, which was what became the Great Northern. And it hauled passengers back and forth, and for a short time it made money hauling freight cars between the two, because that was the only connection between the two. Those are the first two railroads in Minnesota. And then it failed and went away. But in 1872, the St. Paul City Railway started, and that turned out to be permanent. And it was followed in 1875 by the Minneapolis Street Railway. So you had these two separate companies in St. Paul and Minneapolis starting to run horse-drawn streetcars. And the streetcars got gradually bigger over time. But this is kind of the classic view. This is at the corner of Franklin and Chicago. Chicago was 8th Avenue back then. And the building on the left is the horse car barn. And it's called a barn because it had horses in it. And by this time, the full extent of the horse cars they ran about 2, maybe 3 miles from downtown. And so this one went out to about Lake in Chicago, and all these lines were through routed. You come up through downtown, and then this one went up on Monroe Street northeast to Broadway. And so, it was about a 5-mile one-way trip. And after you did about a round trip with this thing, about 10 miles, the horses were tired and they had to be changed out. And that's what you see going on here. They're changing out the team. But all through the 1870s and then especially into the 1880s, you know, horses, while they functioned, had a lot of disadvantages. First, they weren't very fast. These things moved about 5 miles an hour. Second, horses got sick. There was in the 1870s, there was a huge respiratory horse epidemic called the Great Epizootic that just flattened horses nationwide. There's a famous political cartoon that was published in the New York paper of where they had emptied out the jails and harnessed up the inmates to go and pull horse cars because of the epizootic. And the other big thing, of course, is a horse. It took something like 7 horses or 6 horses to keep one of these things running all day because they ran it from like 6 in the morning to 11 at night. And horses deposited epic quantities of manure all over the street, so it was, you know, a health hazard, an aesthetic. So, starting especially in the 1880s, inventors were trying to figure out how in the world to mechanically power a streetcar. Well, the first one to really, by then, the go-to technology was the steam locomotive. And you would think, well, we'll just put steam engines on it and haul all the streetcars. But it had some real downsides, and it actually wasn't used very much for that. The problem with them is that steam locomotives scared horses, and steam locomotives were little rolling pollution sources. And so if you were a housewife with your laundry out, the soot was getting on them. They emitted sparks that burned holes in people's clothes. And so there was only one line in the Twin Cities that wound up using steam locomotives, and it was the little independent Minneapolis, Lindale, and Minnetonka Railroad. And it ran the length of Marquette Avenue in downtown and then took Nicollet all the way out to 50th Street and had a branch over 37th Street to Hiawatha to Minnehaha Falls and had its main line across 31st to Lake Calhoun and then to Lake Harriet, and then for 4 years, from 1882 to 86, they tried to cash in on the Lake Minnetonka tourist boom, and they extended all the way to Hopkins and Excelsior. And then, like I say, they wound up cutting back. And from the moment this thing started running, the residents hated it, and one of the Washburns had a mansion on Marquette. There were mansions on Marquette back then, and managed to get an ordinance passed to forbid these things from running past 6th Street. At 6th Street, they had to uncouple the steam locomotive and put horses on and haul them the rest of the way down to 1st Street. And what you're looking at, that front thing is actually a locomotive. That what looks like a little passenger car body on it is an attempt to fool the horses. There are no passengers in there. This, by the way, is the corner of 31st and Nicollet. And by the way, if you'll notice there's a bus garage at 31st and Nicollet, and the reason there's a bus garage is that this little railroad built a roundhouse there. And after after Minneapolis Street Railway bought this operation and electrified it, they put up a streetcar factory and a car barn there. And after a while, the streetcar factory went away, and they put up a new car barn there. And that one was eventually turned into a bus garage, and then in 1990, a new bus garage was built. So that's why there's a bus garage at 31st and Nicollet, is because of this thing. So anyway, so steam engines were not really the answer. Whoops, sorry, I went the wrong way. Oh, here we go. Yeah, that's down at 6th and Marquette. I forgot I had this slide. And he has stopped, and they're about to put the horses on this thing and haul it the rest of the way. And this little railroad, because there was so much pressure to get rid of the steam engines, in 1885 and 1886, for a couple of months each, they put on an experimental electric locomotive within downtown. It was not successful. Now, all through the 1880s, this guy, a fellow named Van de Poel, and another guy named Daft, he wasn't Daft, but that was his name, and a guy named Frank Sprague, they all competed to see if they could go and harness what they called the electric fluid. Nobody really knew what it was, but they knew it worked. Electricity goes all the way back to, you know, the telegraph and Morse and everything in the 1830s and 40s, but they were trying to figure out how to harness it. And Edison got involved in some of the early research of that. Well, Sprague was the guy who found the right formula of how to gather it, how to regulate it, how to gear it to the wheels so that it worked. And his first, oh, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting something here. I'm getting ahead of myself. We have one more technology to deal with, and then I'll get to the electricity. Cable cars. How many of you were in the San Francisco cable cars up and down the hills? Well, that was a bridge technology, and started in 1873 in San Francisco. There was a guy named Andrew Halliday who manufactured wire rope, braided wire rope, for various things. And the story, which may or may not be mythical, but the story was, he was from San Francisco, and he was watching a horse car go up one of those steep hills, and the horses lost their footing, according to the story, and were dragged a couple blocks down the hill and had to be put down. And he said, well, I got to do something about that. And so what he came up with was the cable car. Now what this is an unpowered vehicle, but you had a stationary steam engine in a powerhouse, and then a very complex system of under-the-track pulleys and sheaves and such. And if you look here, you'll notice there's a slot in the middle of the track, and the cable is under there running on pulleys. And the cable's going about 8-10 miles an hour, continuous. It's about 2 mile long rope or so. And what the cable car does, and if you rode them in San Francisco, you saw the operator standing between the seats in the center of the car, and he had a big lever, and that's called a grip. He's the grip man. And he pulled that grip back, and it would go down, and it would engage the cable and pull the car. And when you wanted to stop, you simply released the cable, and you had a brake lever, and you stopped, and you repeat the thing to go. And it worked. Extremely expensive, very high maintenance, but about 25 cities wound up adopting it. Now, the only one that's left is San Francisco, because it's kind of a cultural icon there. They lasted into the 40s in Tacoma and Seattle, which had some really steep hills. But there are 25 cities, and St. Paul had 2 lines. As a matter of fact, what you're standing up, if you were standing here today, you're at the corner of Selby and Summit. And right behind your left shoulder would be the St. Paul Cathedral. And if you stand in this spot today, that retaining wall next to the streetcar is still there. The street isn't here anymore. It's just grass and a sidewalk going down. If you look over the top of the streetcar, you'll see the early state capitol. And then that church, I don't know the name of the church, but with the 2 steeples, it's still there. So anyway, they built the line up the hill and out Selby Avenue, and they built another one out East 7th Street. There's a long hill going out East 7th Street for about a mile. Well, whenever one of the Twin Cities has something, the other city is envious and has to have it as well, right? So Minneapolis, the City Council of Minneapolis, these things started in 1886. And their experiments of electricity are going on, but haven't yet proven out. And so the Minneapolis City Council orders Thomas Lowry, who by now owned both of the streetcar companies, the St. Paul City Railway and the Minneapolis Street Railway, ordered him to go and put in 6 cable car lines. And so he went out and sold all kinds of bonds and bought the material. And by then it was 1889. And Frank Sprague's first successful system in Richmond, Virginia, which among other things had some very steep hills on it, was successful. And in what I think is the fastest adoption of a technology in the history of North America, the Sprague patents for electric streetcars in about 5 years replaced about 90% of the horse cars, the cable cars, and his competitors' electric cars. And so the first one of them showed up in Minnesota in Stillwater. There was a little Stillwater Street Railway, had a couple 3 lines in Stillwater, including some pretty steep hills. And it showed up in June of '89. And I'm assuming that Thomas Lowry saw that and went to the city council and said, before I go and finish building these cable cars, because he hadn't started construction yet, he said, I'd like to go and try electrifying one line, in this case, the 4th Avenue South line. So he took a couple of horse cars, equipped them with electric motors, and it worked. And they even ran through a snowstorm. And that was the end of the cable cars in Minneapolis. They paid off the bonds in 1930, even though they never had built them. And so this is what the first electric cars looked like. Now, the first electric cars looked like kind of big versions of the cable cars. Not the cable cars, the horse cars. The horse cars were extremely light, so the horses could pull them. And they use kind of the same technology. You notice it's got 2 axles. And they spent the 1890s. They got the system converted to electricity by 1891. And in 1890, by the way, they finally tied the 2 cities together with the University Avenue line, which was known as the interurban. And, but there was a learning curve, and part of that had to do with the design of the streetcars. Now you'll notice that it's an open platform. And so if you were a horse car driver, you were a teamster. And what you did is you stood out on the open platform no matter what the weather was, and you drove your team. That was just expected. Well, these things now had the capability to go 15, 20, 25 miles an hour, maybe even a little bit faster. And nobody had taken the wind chill into account. And it turned out that in like 1892, a motorman in St. Paul froze at the controls to death. And so the state legislature in 1893, in the midst of the Great Recession of 1893, passed a law requiring that the front platform be enclosed. The other thing that happened that they didn't take into account, the horse cars, because they were plodding along kind of at the speed of a fast walk, in order to save the horses' energy, they only stopped the streetcar for women and children and the elderly, the infirm. If you were an able-bodied male, it was expected that you would swing on and off the streetcar it was going along because that got you there faster and saved the horses' energy. Well, these things start going 15, 20, 25 miles an hour, and guys are swinging on and off, and injuries, and I don't know if deaths happened, but you know, unfortunate things happened, and the streetcar company finally decided that they actually had to stop for everybody. And to keep people from jumping on and off the cars, they actually had to put gates. In trade publications, it was called the Minneapolis gate, to actually restrain the passenger and keep them on. Okay, the guy who built the streetcar system was Thomas Lowry. And Lowry came up from Illinois. He was an attorney. His actual interest was in real estate development, but if you couldn't get people to it, your real estate development wouldn't do well, and that's how he got into streetcars. He also wound up, by the way, being the president of the Sioux Line Railroad. So he was quite a guy. And of course, his mansion was on Lowry Hill, which I think is a far better name than the Devil's Backbone. We're on the back. We are kind of on the front side of the Devil's Backbone here, the eastern extreme of it. So there's Lowry. And so he had to finance all of his streetcar construction privately. He had a franchise with both cities, so he had the exclusive right to run them, but he had to pay for it himself, and that required going out east and seeking, financial loans and all. And about 1891-92, his financiers said, if you were to merge these 2 companies, you're more likely to go and raise money. So these are streetcar tokens, and these lasted until the end because of separate franchises. As a matter of fact, if you crossed from Minneapolis to St. Paul, you had to pay another whole fare. It was a whole different, So anyway, he merged the companies into Twin City Lines, actually Twin City Rapid Transit. And many of the 2 streetcar companies were subsidiaries. He had another corporate subsidiary that ran the suburban lines, another one that ran steamboats and amusement parks, and then another one that actually ran the shops. But it was actually all just Twin City Lines. It was mostly just paperwork. So anyway, those early streetcars were not very comfortable and not very capacious. And as the system developed and it grew rapidly, it spurred a huge amount of development, which caused the system, the population of the cities to increase dramatically. And all the way from 1890 up to the early 1920s, the streetcar company had a very difficult time staying ahead of demand. As a matter of fact, they really didn't stay ahead of demand. They were overcrowded the whole time. And so those little 4-wheeled streetcars, they took the old horse-drawn cars and hauled them as trailers, which was really just kind of a jerry-rig solution. What they really needed to do was to go to what they called a double truck streetcar. The trucks are those wheel sets under the cars. And this was established railroad technology, much bigger vehicle, so you could haul a lot more people with the same labor, much more steady ride, faster. And so Streetcar Company had been buying all their streetcars from commercial streetcar builders, and Lowry didn't feel they were up to Minnesota operating conditions, so he said, we're going to build our own. And starting in 1898 and going through 1917, they built 1,200 of these. And so this one here is about 1904, and it's actually in front of the streetcar barn down at 31st and Nicollet. And so what you're looking at here, they saved the very first streetcar from St. Paul, and this is over at the Snelling shops, the Snelling and University. This is where the soccer stadium is today. But they posed this thing to show 50 years, from 1872 to 1921, 50 years of streetcar technology. By the way, the horse car was kept as an artifact, and the building it was in burned in 1925, and so it was lost. Too bad. And so once you had electric streetcars, there was a huge amount of infrastructure to make it work. You recognize this power plant. It's got 4 stacks now over on the east end of the Stone Arch Bridge. Well, this is called the main steam station, and this is a major part of what powered the streetcar system. Big boilers and everything inside. And of course, we're just below St. Anthony Falls here. You can see a portion of it to the right. They had 2 hydro stations, one just out of the frame to the right, another one about a block up on Main Street to the left. And what they would do, because their load in the summertime was bigger than the winter time, they would put the hydro stations online, and they'd take the boilers down kind of one at a time for maintenance in the steam station. By the way, this is the 10th Avenue Bridge. This thing came out right next to it on the 6th Avenue southeast, and if you go out there, the piers for this thing are still in the river, a couple of them. And they actually went through 3 generations of car barns. First were those little wood car barns for the horse cars. They rather quickly got rid of them. Starting about 1891, they built a series of brick but wood-framed smaller car barns for the electric cars. And those things were, had a tendency to burn down. When you have electric-powered streetcars inside a wood building, that'll happen. And they had a series of fires. And so starting in 1907, they began to more or less a standard footprint to put up fire-proof streetcar barns. This is the Nicollet one. You can see Nicollet down on the berm. And by the way, you can see they kept part of the old roundhouse from the motor line in the background. Eventually that went away. And this is the building that you may remember as a bus garage. It was turned into a bus garage, and they added bus bays out there. And this is the one that was replaced in 1990 by the current one. But they built 6 of these. One over on Lake Street, if you know where the Pioneer Cemetery and the High Lake Shopping Center is. The High Lake Shopping Center is where Lake Street Station was. Another one like this. North Side Station still around, and then East Side up in Old St. Anthony. And then they built streetcars at the 31st and Nicollet one until 1907, and then they went and opened up the real streetcar factory, which is Snelling Shops. And this right here, this is the footprint of the soccer stadium. And it was like I said, streetcar factory. They went and built over 700 of them. By the way, the camera's up on Montgomery Ward. And so, it was a big operation. This is the State Fair. And the streetcar terminal projected into the State Fair all the way, originally all the way to the base of the grandstand ramp. And then later here, they cut it back a little bit, about a block. But that whole area where the DNR is, that was all streetcars. And so on the right here, this is about 1915. And on the right is the storage yard and the big turn loop for St. Paul streetcars, and on the left is the one for Minneapolis streetcars. And I mean, they needed all these to haul everybody. Now, what I get a kick out of on this, and if you look carefully up there on the grandstand, you'll see it says War of Nations tonight. And I've seen another one that said the burning of Rome. And so they had spectacles. And by the way, if you go out there today, the letters are the same. Maybe they made new ones that were identical, or maybe it's the same one. Sometime I got to go to the state fair and ask someone on the staff, are these the same letters from like, 1915? I think that'd be cool. And so a gentleman in the front was talking about going to Nicollet Ballpark, and here you see, because Nicollet Ballpark, by the way, was put there because it was next to the streetcar barn, which was a perfect place to stage streetcars. And you can see these streetcars are going to take off all over the city to take the people home after the game. And on Memorial Day and 4th of July and Labor Day, the Millers and the Saints would have what they came to refer to as a streetcar doubleheader. They have a 10 o'clock game in one city, and then they'd hop on the streetcars and have a 3 o'clock game in the other city. And there would be a whole flotilla of streetcars that would, take the crowds over to the other. Now, along with the right to have exclusive right to run streetcars in the city came some city requirements. They were required to pave the track area and maintain the pavement in the track area, the center 2 lanes. And they were required to sprinkle if it was a dirt street. And in the wintertime, they were required to plow the streets. And so they had 17 of these big, heavy plows with wings on them, more powerful motors, ballasted with concrete. This is Nicollet Avenue at about 27th Street looking north. And this thing, most of the streets, they could clear it with one sweep, with the wing out. And of course, you'd have to pull the wing in not to take this car out. Now, I found an article that the St. Paul Pioneer Press did where they went out with one of the crews. And the problem was there were no snow emergencies then, so there were cars all over the place in their way. And because, as you know, the streets get narrower when there's a lot of snow, a lot of the cars would wind up following the track. And this is hard to believe. They had 3 guys on the crew. The motorman who ran the front plow, the wingman who ran the side plow, and a helper. And when they came to a car that they couldn't quite get by, they'd get out, shovel behind the car, and then if you remember how soft car suspensions were, they get on the front of the back and they'd bounce the car over a foot or so. Any of you ever do that? And they did it 100 times in the course of their shift. So, and a lot of times, I found a great newspaper story where the streetcar was going down, I think it's Grand Avenue, and Grand Avenue is notoriously narrow, and came to a car they couldn't get by, and the motorman goes out, goes into the house, goes up to the door, hey, can you move your car? And the guy basically says, screw you. And this is a newspaper story, and a big guy got out of the car, went up, and basically said, I'm going to beat you up if you don't do it. And the guy moved his car. And what the story said was the motorman said, well, you want to keep going then? And he said, no, I'm going to beat the hell out of this guy. So anyway, these are 2 maps, a couple maps made by the city. And this is 1925, and if you look on the map on the left, each dot represents 100 people. And so you can see how much of the city was developed. Now, the streetcar company just didn't build lines willy-nilly. The city had to approve them, and the city basically said, we want to get everyone within a quarter-mile walk of a streetcar stop. And the city wanted the lines built out ahead of development, and the streetcar company did not want the lines built out ahead of development because they were running mileage for no revenue. So it was always kind of a tug of war, but here you see 1925, which is not the full extent. There were a few lines added, but you can see they did a pretty good job. And so when I say this is what shaped the city, I mean, there you go. That's the proof right there. There's the ridership volume from this same set of maps. And as you can see, downtown was the thing. That's why all the big churches, the department stores, the employment, it was all downtown. Why? Because that's where you could get to easily from anywhere in the city. Anywhere in the city, in less than a half hour, you could be downtown. So, of course, it wasn't just, I'm not going to show you the whole St. Paul map. Well, maybe I will. I think it is coming up. But this was a big operation. Now, this is 1909, so they still haven't filled out all the city routes yet, but as you can see, it goes all the way out to White Bear, Stillwater, and down to Bayport on the east, and on the west out to Hopkins, Deep Haven, Lake Minnetonka, and then if you look at Lake Minnetonka, the dotted lines are the company, the express boats, or the streetcar boats as they were called, that went all over the lake. And so it was a huge operation. In addition, there were two independent companies. One is the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range that went to Anoka. They wanted to go to Cuyuna Range, but that never happened. And then the St. Paul Southern to Hastings, and they used the streetcar lines within the city. I'll show you that a little later, I think. And so starting, Lake Minnetonka had gone through a huge tourist boom in the 1880s, tapering off in the 1890s, and it was kind of quiet by 1900. And so Thomas Lowry decided he wanted to go and develop it as a working man's resort. And this was actually the sort of thing that was done all over the country. The standard thing, if they built out into the country, was to go and put some kind of a recreational traffic generator out at the end of it to give people a reason to ride. And there were some 400 across the country of these streetcar electric amusement parks that were out there. The one in St. Paul was Wildwood Park on White Bear Lake that the streetcar company owned. But they went and built Big Island Park in 1905 out on Big Island and put together the 6 streetcar boats to run hourly service to all points on the lake, plus 3 huge ferry boats to go to Big Island. And so here you see at the Excelsior docks, you see the transfer taking place. And these boats, by the way, were built at 31st and Nicollet. And they put them on dollies made out of streetcar trucks and hauled them out to Excelsior. And then, of course, here's Big Island Park, and this is viewed from one of the huge paddle wheel ferry boats that was headed out there. And you can go out there today now. It's an Orono Park. All the foundations of this stuff and the sidewalks are all still there. But it only lasted until 1911 because they were trying to make it work on summer Sundays only, and there just wasn't enough revenue total to keep the whole operation going. So this thing shut down in 1911. The streetcar boats themselves kept going until 1926. So the streetcars had their monopoly until just about World War I. And then something came along called jitneys. People started buying automobiles, and it didn't take long for people to say, you know, I'm driving down University Avenue, in this case here, and there's people standing on every corner waiting for the streetcar. Why don't I just pull over and say, hey, give me your nickel, and I'll take you down the line, you know? And so all of a sudden, hundreds of jitneys, people doing that. Well, the streetcar companies all across America cried foul because they say, look, we got the franchise, you're stealing our revenue, you're not paying, you know. And over the next few years, jitneys were outlawed everywhere. But then automotive technology kept advancing, and you started to have buses, and this is a little early bus here on University Avenue, just east of Fairview. It's World War II, World War I, because that's the point of this picture was to show the Liberty Bonds billboard. And this was one of those cases of technology outrunning regulation, which I think AI is doing now. And so Twin City Lines didn't bother to get the buses outlawed. They bought them all up. Because for a while there were 3 different bus lines running in competition with the University Avenue streetcar. And there was also competitors running on Como Avenue and other streets. And the buses had something of an advantage because they only stopped about once every mile. So they could make it, it took the streetcars about an hour to get from one downtown to the other because they're stopping every block. These buses were essentially expresses, and they'd make it about 40 minutes or so. And so starting in 1924, Twin City Lines simply bought up every bus in the metro area. And had a transportation, they even bought up all the taxi cabs in about 1925. And they had the transportation monopoly until about 1930. And they got rid of the cabs, but they kept the buses. And they actually kept the express buses on University Avenue. But part of the message here is that buses were a very early part of the transit system. It wasn't just streetcars. This is bus number 1 that they bought at night, and this is over at 30th and Grand Street Northeast. And the very first bus line in the Twin Cities that the streetcar company ran was across town, across the Camden Bridge. This thing went from the end of the 2nd Street Northeast line across the Camden Bridge and connected with the streetcar that ran up Washington Avenue North. But it didn't take them long to figure out that you can run buses a whole lot cheaper than streetcars, and so if you have a very lightly traveled line or a suburban market you want to serve, you can put a bus out there. And starting in 1932, they began to replace some streetcars with buses. So the long lines to Excelsior and Deep Haven and out to Stillwater quit in 1932. The Great Depression killed them. And this is the very first bus replacing the streetcar in downtown Excelsior. That's Water Street. You like the Red Owl store sign by there, by the way? And then as the Depression, ridership peaked in 1920 at 238 million. By 1935, it had more than cut in half down to 100 million. And it was the combination of automobile competition and the Depression. The streetcar system actually increased in size by 1/3 in the 20s, while at the same time ridership went down, and that was pure automobile competition. And so in the late 30s, they decided to actually start converting a few more of the local lines from streetcar to bus. And this is the Kenwood St. Louis Park line on the very first day. There was a line out Lake Street to St. Louis Park. There was a line to Kenwood. And they put the two end to end. And by the way, the thing that killed it was the construction of Highway 100, because Twin City Lines didn't want to have to pay for tracks and a bridge over Highway 100. And so they said, we'll just convert it to bus. And this, by the way, is one of the first group of buses they got that really looked like what we think of a bus today with the engine in the rear. These are made by Mack. And you wound up with suburban buses as well. This is downtown Robbinsdale. This is 42nd and Broadway. And there's a Twin City Lines bus there, but this is North Hennepin Transit. There were about, about 8 or 9 small suburban bus companies that grew up in the 30s and 40s and were eventually taken over by Metro Transit in the 70s. So here's the curve. This is what happened. On the left, it's 1930. Way down at the bottom here, it's 35. And then comes along World War II. And you can see what happened. The ridership went all the way back up to 200 million, almost where it had been in the 1920s, only hauled by a much smaller fleet. The fleet was, when they hauled the 200 some million in 1920, they had about 1,000 streetcars. They only had about 750 by the time World War II came along, but they still had to haul almost the same number of people. Well, then after the war, it tails off, and the end is in sight. And so they tried to compete. They hired an engineering consultant in 1944 to say, what's going to happen after the war? And the consultant said, get rid of the streetcars and convert to buses, which was happening, by the way, all across the country. And Twin City Lines was very service-oriented. They didn't pay dividends. They plowed it all back into the property. And they said, well, we think we're not going to take the consultant's suggestion. We're going to keep some of the heavy lines, the Nicolets, the Hennepins, the Lake Streets, University Avenue running. But by then, their old wood streetcars were not only archaic, but were also getting pretty worn out. So they went out and bought 141 of these. And it was a streetcar designed. The streetcar companies got together in the 1930s to come up with something that was competitive. And this is what they came up with, the PCC car. And there were about 5,000 of these things built. They ran all over North America. And Twin City Lines bought theirs in 1946 to 49. And so very smooth. We got one of these. They're fun to ride and fun to drive. They really go. So this is what the streetcar system looked like in 1948. The red lines are the streetcar lines, and then the kind of light green dotted lines, those are the bus lines. And so there were some lines like 38th Street Crosstown, Lowry Crosstown, Cleveland Avenue Crosstown that were always buses. They were never streetcars. There were some others that went early. There's Rondo Avenue. That little dash green thing was a streetcar until 48. but then it quit just before this map came out. And then I mentioned those couple other lines. This is the one up in Anoka. And if it looks like a Twin City built streetcar, it's because it is. They went and built them a couple with baggage compartments in them. And this is the St. Paul Southern down in Hastings. You go down there and those buildings are all still there. This one quit in 27. It never, I don't think it ever did turn a profit. There was a lot of these little lines that were built sort of on speculation. And so here, you can boo and hiss if you will. These are the guys that went and got rid of the streetcars. There's a certain amount of mythology that everyone seems to know, and I always have to correct it. And that is, you know, that General Motors and Firestone and Standard Oil conspired to get rid of the streetcars. Well, what those three companies did is they formed a company called National City Lines to buy up streetcar companies and then re-equip them with buses. But they weren't driving them out. What they were doing was taking advantage of an economic business opportunity. People were abandoning transit in droves. This is after World War II. They were buying cars like crazy. They were moving to the suburbs. There were no subsidies available for streetcar companies. They were dependent on the fare box. Most of their fleets were tired and used up. In the case of Twin City Lines, the electrical generating system was obsolete and would have had to have been replaced at a major cost. They were unable to keep up with their franchise requirements to keep the pavement area and the street done. You didn't have to do those things or plow the streets if you were running buses. And so all across the United States and North America, streetcars converted to bus because of economic necessity. And while there was perhaps a little double dealing in it, basically GM, et cetera, was taking advantage of a business opportunity. Now, those were not the people who did it here. Here it was independent, although the guy on the left, Barney Larrick, was brought in from National City Lines to work on, because he was kind of the operating guy for the changeover. Now, what happened here is that Kid Can Blumenfeld and the local organized crime folks invested in this and bought up a bunch of stock and gave the management kickbacks in order to purchase the scrap rails, all the steel and everything, at well below market prices, as well as the streetcar company owned a lot of real estate, and they didn't need it all. And there were kickbacks to sell those to the mobsters at below market prices. And that's why those folks went to jail. This is Fred Osana, the shorter guy, and he went to jail. As did a guy named Harry Isaacs, who was a scrap dealer from the north side, no relation to me. I get asked that question. And so anyway, they celebrated, they really started taking it apart in 1952. All the St. Paul local lines went in 52. Most of the Minneapolis local lines and the ones, the inner city lines to St. Paul in 53, and then the very last ones in 54. Last day was June 18th of 54. And so shortly before that happened, the streetcar company went and put on a show. Now they were able to get buses because GM, through GMAC, would finance 500 buses for them. And so here they are going down Nicollet Avenue past Dayton's. They ran this parade all over town. There you see conversion complete. They're very proud of themselves. And frankly, a lot of people wanted the streetcars to go. They were viewed as archaic. One of the things motorists didn't like was that you couldn't, if you were following one, you couldn't pass it. If it was stopping every block, you stopped every block. Buses could pull over to the curb and get out of your way. And so here are the bodies. One of the things that they did is if you were within 100 miles of the Twin Cities, for $300 they'd bring you one of these bodies and you could use it for a cheap instant building. So these things got turned into cabins. One got turned into a church in South St. Paul. I've seen one as an appliance dealer, chicken coops. And we found a few of these and turned a couple of them back into streetcars. The PCC cars still had value, and so they were all sold. And this is one of 90 that went to Mexico City, where they ran into the 1980s. 30 of them went to Cleveland, Ohio, where they ran into the 80s. And 20 of them went to, or it was 30, I get my numbers mixed up, went to Newark, New Jersey, where they ran until 2001. And we got one of those cars back, but 11 of them were sold to San Francisco, completely rehabbed, and are running on Market Street in the Embarcadero. There is one now running a loop in downtown in San Diego, and there's at least a half a dozen of them in trolley museums. So those are the ones that lasted. So anyway, this would probably be a good time to do some questions, because the next part of this, I'm going to show you pieces that survived. But if you've been saving up questions, why don't we do a little of that, and then I'm going to show you the rest of these pictures. Go ahead.
Outstanding. All right, anybody got any questions?
Or comments, we'll take comments.
What streets, I mean, I drive down 4th Avenue southeast. There's streets that still have the tracks under pavement. How many of those do we have?
It's getting fewer and fewer, because they occasionally, they'll dig one down to the dirt. But a couple I can think of is Xerxes from 44th to 50th, Grand Avenue in St. Paul all the way out. You know, one way you can tell, what they did is they just went and asphalted them over. And you can usually see the cracks. The cracks are usually where the tracks are. Yeah, you'll see two parallel sets of cracks. And occasionally I know Smith Avenue this last year in the Cherokee Heights section of St. Paul, above the High Bridge, they had some sticking through. So I don't have a comprehensive list of where they are, and a lot of them are gone, but there's still quite a few.
So the organized crime involvement was just profiting off the demise of the railroad, the
Yes.
streetcars. It didn't actually engineer the demise of them.
Well, they were co-conspirators. They were involved.
Together.
Yeah.
Hi, I did a paper on this in college, so it was 100 years ago, but I speculated that Mr. Lowry really was pretty smart at making money on real estate. And so the streetcar company was just helping him make money on real estate. But can you tell us a little bit more about that, the relationship between him building the streetcars where he did and him buying the land first and stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't know all the property he had. He had some in South Minneapolis around here. I think not far from here, maybe over by Lindale. He was involved with the development of St. Louis Park, and they actually went. He and his partners actually built a separate streetcar line from Uptown out into St. Louis Park, which then later was absorbed by Twin City Lines. He was the primary landowner of Columbia Heights. He had a bunch of property off Central Avenue in far northeast Minneapolis, and he pretty much owned Columbia Heights from 37th up to about 45th Avenue northeast. As a matter of fact, I just learned not too long ago, the waterworks, the Minneapolis City Reservoir that's way up on Reservoir Boulevard, he donated the land for that. To the city of Minneapolis. So there was definite cause and effect.
Didn't he also have some milling company by the river close to the falls, or am I thinking of somebody else?
I think you're probably thinking of Washburn. But to the best of my knowledge, Peter, I don't know if you, no, Peter's shaking his head no. I never heard of him involved with milling. Anybody else there?
Anybody else?
Okay, well, now I've got some pictures since this is Preserve Minneapolis. This is stuff that's still around before and after. So first, you know where the Monte Carlo restaurant is there, 3rd Avenue North and 2nd Street?
I go there every day.
Okay, well that's across the street. This building actually wound up with like 3 different uses. It was built initially as a huge horse car barn. And then you'll see the addition on the back with the smokestack. That was added when they decided to build to put in cable cars. That was going to be the cable car powerhouse. And neither one of the, they got rid of the horse cars and the cable cars didn't happen, so this became a streetcar barn. But it also became the original powerhouse to power the electricity before they built the main steam station by the Stone Arch Bridge. So anyway, this thing is still sitting there. Well, it's right on the corner of 3rd Avenue North and 2nd Street.
And were the upper floors added at the same time as the powerhouse, do you know?
I don't know when the upper floors were added. That's a good question. Okay, this is Northside Station. This is one of those 5 fireproof car houses to basically a standard design. And it's at the corner, it's on Washington Avenue North at 24th Avenue North. In other words, it's halfway between Lowry, more or less halfway between Broadway and Lowry on the east side of Washington Avenue. But it was opened in 1915. When they converted to bus, the structure that you see in the front, which were bus bays and a bus shop that filled the entire city block, those were added in what before was just the open storage yard for the streetcars. And buses ran out of here, and it was just a horrible facility. The bus bays had dirt floors. Now, I worked for Metro Transit, and when this thing was still in operation, they wound up giving rubber boots to all the bus drivers so they wouldn't sink in the mud when they went out to get their bus. But anyway, it was replaced by a new bus garage in 1984, and it survives as kind of a light industrial warehouse building. Still there. There's the main steam station. And the U of M owns it, and it's been pretty drastically rebuilt inside and supplies power to the U of M. Okay, now we're going to take kind of a run out the Como-Harriet line. And the Como-Harriet line went out Hennepin Avenue to 31st Street, went over and went down the alley between Irving and James Avenue. And so you're looking at you're standing at 34th Street, looking north. And it took me a while to figure out what had happened. Originally, there was a separate auto alley to the left, which is to say the Lake Calhoun side of the right-of-way. In other words, there were the streetcar tracks, and next to it was a narrow automobile alley. And there was only access off the houses that were on James Avenue or along the Parkway could access that alley. The houses on the Irving Avenue side had no access to it. And so when the streetcar went away, they went and shifted the auto alley onto the streetcar right-of-way. And what had me confused, and I think I can point it out here, if you look down here, you'll see a garage that is abutting the alley. That is a post-1954 garage, because all the old garages pre-54 are set back. And what they did is they turned the old auto alley over to the adjacent property owners, and they were able to build garages out there. But anyway, this thing went down the alley for 3 blocks. And now the remnant that's there besides that is this fence right here. And this fence was put up by the streetcar company. And how do I know it was streetcar? It's held up to this day by sawed-off overhead wire poles and old pieces of very small rail. And I am convinced that that rail is from the little steam-powered motor line, which was what actually built this way back in 1879. So it's just a cool little artifact that nobody knows about. Well, you know about it now. Oh, okay, here, yeah, this is what the fence looks like. And you can see on the left picture, those are little railroad rails, vertical, and here that's a sawed-off overhead wire pole. I forgot I had that picture. Okay, so this thing goes south of 34th Street, and there's now from 34th to 36th, there's an informal walking path that the neighborhood has created. And if you come down to what you would think would be 35th Street, but it's a little stub-end street on the east side called Conieris Way. I think it's named for someone who was involved with the Greek Orthodox Church. And at the end of that, there are these steps that go down to a little concrete platform. And that was a streetcar stop. And somebody went to all the trouble of actually the city went and rebuilt it with concrete. and it's still there. And the park board has some plans to kind of more formalize this. If you go out here today, you'll see an occasional cross tie and a spike there. When they got rid of the thing, they didn't take the ties out of the ground. And so now here we are on our streetcar line. And this is the William Berry Road Bridge, which was originally named the Interlochen Bridge because it went from Lake Calhoun to Lake Harriet. And this, it turns out, is significant because it was the first pre-stressed concrete bridge in Minnesota. At least that's what the guy who did the book on bridges said. And it was actually, there were kind of two versions of this. So you'll notice there were two tracks there originally, and now there's one. Now, when they built it, the track was actually several feet higher. And when they went to bring the streetcar boats from Nicollet Station, Nicollet Car House, out to Lake Minnetonka, and they experimented with double-deck streetcars, they had to lower the track. And so this knee wall that you see along the side, and then this little set of steps that comes down, that was all added in 1905 when they lowered the track. And so here we are down at just north of 42nd Street, and this pedestrian underpass is original streetcar stuff. You can see it on the left. Before there was a long wrought iron fence between the tracks, and so if you were going to the lake for a concert or whatever, this is where you got off on this platform, and you went down and under. That's why that thing is there. And we rehabbed it because the concrete was in pretty bad shape, but it's still an original artifact. Now, if you come out and ride our trolley today, where you buy your ticket is in a replica of what was the original 1901 station. And this little building was really just built for the neighborhood at 42nd Street. And in 1912, it was replaced by what everyone calls the Chalet Station, which was a much bigger building jointly built by the park board, actually owned by the park board, with a big waiting room and a canopy for the passengers. But inside was a confectionery ice cream place. Facing the lake was a big dining area with removable windows in the summertime. There's a basement in it with storage for the park board and a holding cell for the park police. And that lasted until 1955. Well, we didn't have the money to build that, so we built this. This little thing had an amazingly long life. In 1912, when it was replaced by the bigger building, this was picked up, moved down to the west shore of Lake Harriet, and became a canoe rental office. And it was there for decades. And I've got two pictures of it where at some point they moved it up next to the refectory in the 1950s. And it appears that it was scrapped sometime in the 50s. If you know the temporary band shell from the 1920s and the refectory that went with it, this thing was sitting right next to that in the 1950s. So, it had kind of a long life. Let's see here. Okay, so moving further down the line, this is the south end of our line. We're standing on Linden Hills Boulevard. You can see our car barn down there. But this retaining wall here was built in 1916 by the Streetcar Company. And before that, we have pictures. It was just an earthen embankment and apparently was not stable. And so they put this retaining wall up and apparently had to encroach 8 feet into Queen Avenue to do it, which didn't make the residents across the street happy, but they did it anyway. Okay. So we're moving out along the line. So the line is now the alley that runs east of Upton Avenue, and then crosses Upton Avenue by the Great Harvest Bakery and what is now the Martina restaurant and all that. That whole parking area there is alley. Now what I should explain is when the streetcars quit in '54, the city came along and bought the right-of-way from Lake Calhoun through Linden Hills to 44th and France with the idea of putting a road on it. It was going to be like a little mini highway through there. Well, they never built it, but they still own it. And so it's 50 feet wide, except they've given away all but 10 feet in Linden Hills to the adjacent businesses. But then it goes out parallel to 44th Street. And on it now to the right, this is looking west from Xerxes Avenue. And on it, they built the trolley path for 2 blocks from Xerxes to Zenith. They're looking at extending it further. You go out further, and the parking lot for the 44th and France liquor store is the old streetcar right away. If you remember the little steam-powered line, and it was nicknamed the motor line for those little steam motors that ran. And even though it only ran out there for 4 years west of Lake Harriet, 2 streets are out there that are named for it. Motor Place runs between Beard and Chowan. There's a little thing that looks like a park, only it's not a park, it's the streetcar right-of-way. As a matter of fact, there's a Christmas tree set up on it every year around the holidays. Well, that's Motor Place. And then if you go way out to just short of 44th and Brookside, there is a little tiny half-block long street in Edina called Motor Street, which is where this thing ran. So, it's always interesting to see what survives. And then the right-of-way continued out along the south side of Meadowbrook Golf Course and the north side of Interlaken Golf Course, and went right past the south side of Blake School, and that's what you're looking at here. Blake School is up on the hill to the right of where you see the streetcar. And now there's a bike path on that stretch. And you can see beyond the streetcar, you can see the Hopkins Water Tower out there. And then in Hopkins, this is the line until 1932, went all the way out to Excelsior. Well, if you drive Excelsior Boulevard through Hopkins, it's the old streetcar right-of-way. And it continues to be the old streetcar right-of-way until you get out to 494. And then it separates, and it winds up going through backyards and parallels Excelsior Boulevard all the way out into Minnetonka. But then, when you get past Minnetonka High School, maybe a half a mile west of Highway 101, the streetcars quit out to Excelsior in 1932, and as soon as they quit, the Minnesota Highway Department bought it and put Highway 7 on it. And it's Highway 7 out to Excelsior, and the Excelsior off-ramp is the streetcar. As a matter of fact, until about 15 years ago, the bridge that goes over the walking trail, which was the old Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad as you come into Excelsior, was the streetcar bridge. So here's an artifact. We are in Theodore Wirth Park at the west end of the Glenwood Avenue line. And the Glenwood Avenue line pulled into the park and backed in next to this waiting shelter. Now, the waiting shelter was built by WPA in 1937, and it's still there. And we wanted to get it, to take it and put it on the Bede-Makoska end of our streetcar line, and the State Historic Preservation Office said, no, you can't do it. You're removing it from its original context. What we did do, there was a huge cottonwood tree that was growing into it and starting to push it over, so at least we got them to cut down the cottonwood trees so they wouldn't push this thing over anymore. But it's still out there, and if you look at it, it's not near anything, but it's a streetcar waiting shelter.
You think they'd let it go to a streetcar museum?
Wouldn't you? That was the argument we made. So anyway, the park board owns it, and the park board said, well, we're not going to cross SHPO. So now, this is, the black and white picture is a waiting shelter at Hopkins. That's the Minneapolis Moline tractor plant there. And it turns out that there were a whole series of these along the Excelsior line. Well, we found one. It's in somebody's backyard in Minnetonka. And they're south of Excelsior Boulevard and east of 101. And there was a stop at Highway 1 called the Clear Spring Stop. And we think this is the shelter from the Clear Spring Stop. And they've gone and they've, turned it into a screen structure. But they were nice enough, let us take pictures of it. And that's what it is. Here's a little bit of obscure but an interesting thing. There was something called the City Beautiful movement in the 1920s. And part of that was eliminating unsightly clutter on sidewalks. And so this is the corner of 8th and Hennepin. Now you got to look real carefully. Let's see if I can see it here. Right. See this spot right here? And if you look carefully, you'll see a wire going across. Well, rather than have overhead wire poles on the sidewalk every 100 feet or so, they started hanging them from buildings. And if you go into downtown Minneapolis or downtown St. Paul and look at a like a World War II or before era, these things are hanging on the walls. And this is that very corner. There's the eye bolt. There's another eye bolt. And that's the reason that they're up there. And you can find these all up and down Marquette and Hennepin, and you go to St. Paul, Wabasha, 7th Street, and they're there. I think it's kind of cool. Okay, here's another really subtle thing. This is the corner of 50th and Penn. And you're looking north. And the streetcar is sitting on what they called a Y. And that's how they turn the streetcars around. You'd pull across the intersection and then back up into the side street and then do this. That's a Y. And so this is the old Harriet car. This is the one that came down Xerxes and across 50th, came across and backed into the Y. Well, if you go up here, and you got to look at this pretty carefully. As soon as you get past the end of the Y, the street narrows. The only reason the curb line goes out was so the streetcar could sit here and you could get vehicles by it. And there's 3 or 4 of these things around. 38th and Bryant has one. I'm trying to think if there are any others, but it's once again, it's just a ghost of something that happened in the past. Let me see what else I got here. Oh, here we go. If you go out to Highway 55, Hiawatha Avenue, just before you get to the crosstown, there is this retaining wall, and this is the Bureau of Mines building that then leads over to the VA hospital. And this retaining wall is where the tracks were. Yeah, let's see what we got here. Oh, okay. I told you about the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range, the one that went up. It ran out the 2nd Street Northeast line, and you know where the Riverside Power Plant is? Up just kind of across from Camden, and it's still there. And this thing started there and went all along the edge of East River Road and then Coon Rapids Boulevard to Anoka. Well, after World War II, or not after World War II, when World War II started, the line was bought by Northern Ordnance, the big Northern pump, which then became, I think, FMC, up there on East River Road, just south of 694, big defense plant. And they used the southern, like 2 miles of it or so, to bring freight up into their factory and to shuttle employees from the end of the 2nd Street line. And they kept 3 of the streetcars and painted them red, white, and blue, and used to shuttle them. Well, anyway, this is Marshall Avenue, which turns into East River Road here, just north of St. Anthony Boulevard. You're getting up close to the city limits. And it went under this portal of the bridge. And what I think is cool is that the overhead wire hangers are still under the bridge. Once again, this is obscure stuff, but I don't know about you, I'm into this. Well, you know how if you're a good historian and you stumble upon something you didn't think you were going to see, and the endorphins start flowing and everything, because you're primed. Well, that's me. So, and it turns out that there is about a 1/4 mile or so of this railroad left in operation. And the reason is that it had 2 spur tracks that crossed East River Road to go into the waterworks. And the Great Northern Railroad bought what was left of the thing in 1966, I think it was, and got rid of everything except that they built a connector over from Northtown Railroad Yard, and they still go into the waterworks because they need freight cars. And the proof of this is that. Now, this is really inside baseball, but you can come away from this knowing stuff other people don't know. See this thing right here? That's a rail bond. Now, when you have an electric trolley line, the overhead wire is the positive. How does the power get back to the powerhouse? You have to have the rails are the negative. And the rails have to be bonded together or the electricity will not get through this gap right here where the rails meet. And so the only reason this thing is bonded is this thing used to be a trolley line. If you go out and look at our little streetcar line, there are rail bonds between all of them. So there you go. Now you have obscure knowledge. Over in St. Paul are a few cool things, and the coolest of which, I think, is the bottom of the Selby Tunnel. That cable car that went up the hill, that was on a 16% grade. You can't run a regular adhesion vehicle up a 16%, or at least not a rail one. The steepest trolley grade in North America was 12%. And so Twin City Lines, when they wanted to get rid of the cable car and electrify it, what they did is they dug this tunnel, which they referred to as a subway, up the hill and surfaced a block west of the St. Paul Cathedral and cut the grade from 16% down to 7%, which is manageable. And so this thing ran until 1953. When they quit, they simply covered over the upper end, but the whole rest of it is still there. And this is the bottom end. It's kind of deteriorated. They've closed off the entrance because, of course, otherwise people are living in there. But if you get in there, the rails are all still there in the concrete floor. And this thing is like a block and a half away from the Minnesota Historical Society, and I wish somebody put some money into this and just kind of cosmetically fix it up. That'd be nice. And then Como Park. Como Park's got a whole bunch of stuff. And the city went and built that depot back, about 1910 or so, and out of Fieldstone, and they have offices in it. They have a big community room in there, and when they kind of rehabbed the place, they went and created a mosaic map of the St. Paul streetcars in the floor. If you go over there, it's a St. Clair Avenue and Grand Avenue. But anyway, you see there was a fence down the middle, and this pedestrian bridge was to cross over, so you wouldn't have, the fence was in the way. And so St. Paul got some federal money and rehabbed that bridge about 10 years ago or so, and it's in operation. And then you go a little further, and I don't know if I have it here, I don't. But you go a little further, and Lexington Avenue humps up over this right-of-way, and now part of the right-of-way is a bike trail. So anyway, one thing I should say, if you want to get more streetcar history, go to the museum's website, trolleyride.org. We have over 50 slideshows on there. We've got 5 different programs with vintage video of when they were actually running. And if you want to be bored stiff hearing me talk, that's the place to go. All right.
Thank you for watching this Preserve Minneapolis presentation. To learn more or to donate, go to preserveminneapolis.org.